welcome our listeners to the Responsible Edge back for another show, a show brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter. And this week, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Rob. Rob, thank you so much for agreeing to give us some of your time this morning, this cold February morning here in the UK. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Charlie. Well, thank you for the invitation. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And I'm not remotely intimidated by the fact that only about 2 episodes ago you interviewed John Elkington, the godfather of the triple bottom line. So thank you.
Well, we're on a bit of a run here on the Responsible Edge with guests. So I'm delighted that we managed to snaffle you for an episode and for you to give us your time. So let's start with the first sort of 20 minutes or so, Rob, giving our listeners who aren't aware of you and the work you've done so far in your career just a flavor as to your background and in particular, because of the nature of our show, the role that kind of corporate ethics, responsibility and sustainability has played in you doing what you've done so far.
Sure. Thank you. Well, I'll spare you the full CV, but the short summary is that essentially twice in my career, including the first time straight out of university, I've chosen to work for Shell. So I worked for Shell for about 9.5 years straight out of university. I actually joined in the same intake as former Prime Minister Liz Truss and comedian Jimmy Carr. So there's a bad joke there, I'm sure. And I then spent 7 years out of Shell. In the middle of my career, I worked for the Foreign Office as a diplomat, advising Whitehall and Westminster on Middle East energy issues. And then I moved back to the Middle East to set up a consultancy, which I ran for 5 years before being tempted back to Shell. And I've just finished a second 12 years there. I left Shell at the end of last year and now have the luxury of thinking about what I might do next. And in terms of the sort of ethical business angle, that came really early. So I was at university applying for graduate roles, and Shell was a company I was very keen to join because, in fact, I'd had a very international childhood. My father had worked in the energy business. By the time I was 18, I'd lived in Thailand, Gibraltar, Italy, and Kenya. So when I was thinking about my own career and speaking to careers officers at the university, I was just keen to have the most international career I could. And the advice I was given at the time was that statistically the biggest employers of Brits overseas, whether this was right or wrong, I don't know, were Shell and the Foreign Office. And I've worked for both of them. So that's kind of worked out. But right back in those early days, I joined Shell for the first time as a graduate in 1996. And in 1995, 2 really sort of company-defining moments had happened for Shell. These are sort of ancient history to many people now, but really fundamental to indeed the sort of things that you were discussing, of course, with John Elkington, who was very much engaged on triple bottom line around that same time. One was the Brent Spar. This was when Shell decided that it was going to sink an oil storage tank in the North Sea, and Greenpeace objected and protested, and it became a debate in Parliament and an international outcry, and eventually Shell had to change its mind. And also in 1995, so when I already was going through the recruitment process but hadn't yet joined the company, the Nigerian government executed some or put to death, I should say, some human rights activists, including the very high-profile Ken Saro-Wiwa, a human rights activist from the Niger Delta, from the Ogoniland area. So, from the moment I walked through the door of Shell for the first time in September 1996, it was against a background of challenge and criticism, scrutiny of corporate behavior, but also recognizing that this was a company that was really, really trying hard to do the right things. Not always getting everything right, but really trying hard to do the right thing wherever it worked.
And that, Rob, as you say, was something that was particularly attractive to you. As a young man, you were concerned about, your career aligning with working with a company that you felt the ethics of were were aligned with your own. That was core to your decision making.
Absolutely. So, I was pretty much having to sort of almost defend my career choice to my friends and peers down the pub before I'd even walked through the door. And I think that set a backdrop that over the two stints that I spent at Shell, and indeed the time that I spent out of Shell in the middle of my career, were really, that was just, it became increasingly important. It was very clear that the scrutiny was only going to get more intense. And it was very clear that it was only good corporate behavior that was going to be adequate, sufficient, and certainly aligned with my own values.
And out of interest, Rob, just to take you back to this, and I do want to pry into some of the sort of more formative, years and experiences for you, and talk about traveling and the impact that had on you. But just taking you back to those moments in the pub with friends, having to defend your decision making. Can you recall some of the sort of the topics of discussion? Can you recall the sorts of things that friends were proposing to you about joining a company?
Yeah, and interestingly, over the last 25 years, the emphasis has very much shifted. I don't think at the time I recall very much, if any, challenge around fossil fuels per se. And the climate agenda, that clearly was there and it was in the background, but it was much less a topic of day-to-day debate and media coverage. So I think it was really around environmental performance outside of climate. So things like what you do with disposal at sea and what do you do with end-of-life facilities and assets. And it was human rights. And as I say, both of those have been brought into very stark focus in 1995. And I think, it was only a couple of years later that actually with John Elkington's help, Shell produced what was one of the very first corporate sustainability reports. And, set Shell on a path of striving constantly to do better, be more transparent and engage more widely in that space.
And Rob, and let me ask you. So, in fact, one thing that we've not covered when talking about your education and the roles that you took on when you joined Shell, what did you do at university? What sort of led you to and what was your first role at Shell?
So I was quite focused from school age on that concept of an international career, and so I decided to study commerce at the University of Birmingham. So when Birmingham was founded, I think it only taught engineering, medicine, and commerce. So although business studies is a newer version of it, commerce was actually quite an old course at Birmingham, very much preparing people to go into industry rather than finance. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of vocational, and I've used elements of what I've learned in my course at many points in my career. The careers advice I got was to do a work placement in my second year at university. So that was when I ended up sharing a house over a summer with Liz Truss, I think for longer than she was in number 10, and then joined Shell a year later. And I started as the title was business analyst. I was, running spreadsheets on international energy projects, particularly focused on LNG, liquefied natural gas, which was then still quite an emerging business area for Shell. Shell had been a very early pioneer and investor, but it hadn't yet at all become the size and scale of business globally, and indeed for the company that it is today. But also, and I think this was frankly just because I was the youngest person around and therefore assumed to be the most sort of tech savvy and internet savvy. I mean, amazingly, I was involved in helping to produce the very first corporate website.
Oh, right.
And was asked to, help to produce content on the natural gas business. And I think that very early on gave me some exposure to what has ended up being a career very focused on corporate affairs. But that wasn't the initial plan. I don't think corporate affairs really did exist as a career-long path in those days in the same way that it does now. And I'd certainly never heard of it.
Well, it obviously grew and developed alongside all that you did, and then you're at Shell for 7 years, as you say, during that first stint.
9 and a bit.
Sorry,
yeah,
9.
I just dodged the cufflinks that you get at 10 or whatever it was at the time.
Did you get the cufflinks having just left this time?
The modern equivalent, which I think was more sort of financial and remote by email, but yes.
Oh, okay, yes, because we 12 years of the most original stint. Rob, let me ask you. So you have the 9.5 years at Shell. Talk us through the decision making, the thinking that was going on that led you to then join the Foreign Office. Like what was going on at that point?
So I was being sort of groomed internally, I guess, to be a project commercial lead and developer of projects, particularly in the LNG business. I spent the last 18 months of that first stint working a lot on a potential project in Iran that never came into being, mainly because of the sanctions. But that process, I guess, taught me two things. One was that I probably didn't want to spend the rest of my career negotiating for the last $10 million of NPV of a project that may or may not happen. But also that what I found most interesting in that process was the government engagement, the stakeholder engagement, not just with the governments responsible for the project, but also engaging with other stakeholders about how this project might be viewed, whether it would be possible, how you would do it. And so, had corporate affairs been a career option at that point, that would have probably been what I chose to do, but it really wasn't at that point. So I thought, well, I don't really want to keep becoming a commercial developer. I saw an advert in the back of The Economist. The Foreign Office was advertising for the first time to hire reasonably senior people in at mid-career to come and advise them on energy matters. I applied assuming that there was no chance I would get the job. I thought they would need somebody much more grey-haired and experienced and wise than me. But I got the job, and it was just a fantastic opportunity to learn about stakeholder engagement, about government engagement, about sort of corporate diplomacy from the real experts, from the diplomats in the Foreign Office.
And Rob, out of interest, because how long were you then with the Foreign Office?
I was only there 2 years. It was a 2-year fixed contract, which I chose not to extend. I always say those 2 years were the most fascinating and frustrating of my career. Fascinating because, the things you get to work on, the things that you get to read and see, and the conversations you have are things that you'll never have access to if you're not inside that tent. But on the other hand, of course, if you've come from the private sector and you're used to clear scorecards, profit metrics, share price, success metrics, etc., working in government can sometimes seem a little bit like pushing treacle uphill. So I was ready to leave at the end of the 2 years, but I absolutely loved it, and I definitely wouldn't have had the career that I've had since then had I not spent that time there.
Well, that was almost gonna. You're a brilliant guest, Rob. You segue into the next question beautifully. I wanted to ask you about that. What were the kind of key lessons that you took from your time working in government that then you applied to your corporate affairs career that sort of happened thereafter? Like, what were the sort of major beacons of insight that you thought, I'm taking that with me, that's going to be incredibly helpful moving forward?
I mean, it was interesting. I was invited because at the time, I think it really was pretty rare to have somebody with 10 years. I mean, it wasn't massive career-long experience, but I had 10 years in a private sector company. And indeed, a couple of very senior people invited me early on to comment and observe on anything in the Foreign Office that I thought that the Foreign Office could be doing better based on my experience of having worked in a very large multinational corporation. And there were definitely things in that direction, but also there were definitely things that the Foreign Office and government was doing better than Shell, in my view. One of them was knowledge sharing. I think as a diplomat, your currency is the knowledge that you share. It's not the knowledge that you hold or withhold. It's the knowledge that you share. And, even just the simplicity of the way that the IT systems were set up to sort of blast out and share information rather than, as in most corporates, you're dependent on somebody choosing who to copy into an email and who to share information with. The Foreign Office had a system that worked rather differently. It sort of came to you if you'd subscribed to that topic. And And I thought that was really interesting. But I think just being at the table and in the room of a lot of conversations between officials and indeed between ministers in different countries was a great learning experience. One thing that I was really impressed by was that during just the 2 years that I was there were 3 foreign secretaries. I think Jack Straw became, Margaret Beckett became David Miliband.
Mm-hmm.
And with each of them, Margaret Beckett particularly, and then David Miliband took it on another level. Climate change really shot up the Foreign Office priority list from really not having been on the radar, particularly before then. And what was really impressive to see was how ambassadors across the Middle East, which was the region that I was covering, who were career diplomats, they had no background or experience in climate change for the main, how they learned the topic and absorbed it, and within weeks, frankly, of being given new marching orders from the centre, were able to go out and confidently have conversations, engaging energy ministers, environment ministries, civil society and others in the country where they were based, on a topic that isn't straightforward and is very complex. And that was really impressive to see. So actually, although my job title was Middle East Energy Advisor, by the end of just 2 years, really, my job title was Middle East Climate Change Advisor, because at the time, OPEC and particularly Saudi Arabia were seen to be the really key blockers to further progress in the UNFCCC Kyoto process, as it was then. And, having conversations directly with, in fact, the prince who's now the Saudi oil minister, he was then the deputy oil minister, about climate change and about how that would impact Saudi Arabia's own oil business, but what also opportunities there might be for Saudi Arabia to invest as new business models were emerging. I mean, that was just a great privilege.
Absolutely. And Rob, from your perspective personally, was this the first time that climate change had really kind of, been substantiated on your agenda personally? Was this during this phase? Because you mentioned how joining Shell and back at the beginning, it really wasn't on anybody's radar or agenda.
Well, I mean, there would have definitely been people writing about, thinking about, and working on climate change issues in Shell right from the time I joined, but it wasn't. The energy transition. I don't really remember when I heard that term for the first time, but it definitely wasn't common currency in that first stint that I did at Shell. So yes, I mean, learning about the clean development mechanism as it was then, the sort of forerunner of a lot of what we hope is going to be massive global carbon trading. Learning about carbon capture and storage, a technology that is always, just around the corner and remains, a key component of how the energy transition may advance. But, even back then in whenever this was, 2005, 2006, having early conversations with Middle East governments about how that might work. So yeah, it was a great learning experience.
And then from then on, Rob, you then started your own consultancy at that point. Is that right? After the 2 years?
Not quite my own. So what I did essentially, I'd worked by that point for 12 years for very big organizations, and I had a sort of sense that I wanted to do something more entrepreneurial. But with our first child on the way, I didn't feel this was quite the moment to jump off and start something completely from scratch. So essentially, I shopped around London for the smallest company I could find that would lend me a sort of brand and some intellectual property to go out and build a business in the Middle East. And that's what I did. I joined a company called Register Larkin, which has since been acquired by Deloitte. At the time, it was about 25 people in London with no international presence and very few international, some international clients, but servicing them mainly out of London. And I moved out with my wife and I and a 6-month-old daughter to Abu Dhabi. We'd lived in Dubai at the end of my first Shell stint, and built a business from scratch effectively. I mean, although I did have a business card with a logo on it, and I was very lucky to have a monthly salary to start the business with. Nobody knew the company, and it was really a case of me going out and marketing myself. There was only me for the first 18 months. And then as more and more clients came, I took on more colleagues. And at the end of 5 years, I think we were 7 people across 3 offices in the Middle East, working for pretty much every oil and gas company in the region, both state-owned and international private company, and a lot of complex joint ventures between the two, which I think is something that is a particular feature of the energy sector that makes it very fascinating.
And what was that like for you, Rob? Because I mean, you've got an amazing kind of I don't know, Russian doll of sort of professional experience here, working for as big as it gets corporation, working for government, and then working from the sort of the entrepreneurial sort of startup, well, not startup, but you know what I mean, scale opportunity. What was that like for you, like personally? What did you take from?
Well, I think the key thing is it wasn't at all what I expected. I expected that working in a UK-based communications and reputation management consultancy in the Middle East would teach me a lot more to turn me into a more rounded corporate affairs professional in terms of reputation management and communications. And I did learn some of that. But I think a lot of my clients in the Middle East were relatively early in their own reputation management journeys. So I was rarely at the sort of cutting edge of corporate affairs and reputation management. I think the Middle East was possibly 5-10 years behind where a lot of UK companies were, for example, UK listed companies at least. So I didn't feel that I was really learning at the very cutting edge of the content. But what I really enjoyed much more than I expected was the process of building up a company and winning the work. And the real sort of, get in moments were not so much fascinating engagements with the CEOs of the companies, helping them to do better reputation management. It was assembling extraordinary teams, often of associates, because we were a very, very small team of actual employees, going up against some of the world's largest corporate affairs conglomerates and winning mega clients, mega contracts. And that was a lot of fun.
There's nothing quite like it, is there? There's the hitting of the gong moment when you think, oh, we did it. Rob, I literally think we could do an entire show just hearing you talk about your experience and delving into some of the things that you've learned along the way. I have got one more question for you though, and I know we've just scratched the surface before we move on to the article for today. When you think about, when you start sort of, you mentioned that you're at a stage now where you're thinking about what you want to do next. Like, what does the rest of your career look like in terms of what you would like to achieve?
I wouldn't mind staying in the energy sector, but I'm also very keen to use this moment of, I turned 50 last year, thinking about the next sort of decade of my career to move into a different sector. I'd love to keep learning. I think there are a number of other sectors that are quite sort of business to business, but particularly business to government focused, where the government often is not just your regulator, but often your customer or just such a critical partner to enable you to succeed, with a strong emerging market focus. So things like the defense sector, big agriculture, I think is absolutely fascinating and vital to the world. How to feed the world sustainably and responsibly, I think is just a huge, huge challenge. Mining and resources are, of course, very adjacent sectors to particularly upstream oil and gas. So there's a range of different things that I would like to do, but I would like to keep working at that intersection particularly, and I guess this is exactly what we're going to talk about today, really, where a company is being held to account and scrutinized to, let's call them Northwest European standards, but operating in emerging markets, which could be anywhere, Asia, Africa, Latin America, but particularly for me, Africa and the Middle East are the two that I know best. And I think that's just a fascinating challenge and tension that needs managing and is really important to get right. And of course, the scrutiny in Northwest Europe is probably only going to go in one direction, albeit that we're seeing some swing away from the ESG focus over the last 18 months, 3 years, or whatever it's been. But I think overall, the scrutiny is only going to go in one direction, which is getting greater and greater as more transparency exists in the world, more transparency is expected of companies. And I think how you manage that tension and some of the dilemmas that are thrown up on it, I just think is absolutely fascinating.
Brilliant, Rob. And there's a common theme throughout, I think, reflecting on your career of that eagerness to learn and to take inspiration, if you like, from different sources. And it sounds like that's going to be continuing as you move forward. Now, as I mentioned, we've obliterated our 20 minutes on you as expected. But would you mind now, Rob, just perhaps providing a bit of a summary, bit of a synopsis of the article that we shared with you about a week or so ago? Yeah. I think it was Amalia Liu from Clyde & Co. LLP from August last year. Would you mind providing a summary and then just picking out perhaps whatever the most interesting points were from that piece for you?
Sure. So I guess indeed it was a sort of blog post on Clyde & Co.'s website. And the author is a Tanzanian lawyer based, I think, in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam. And that in itself is interesting, having a lawyer working for a Western company based in an emerging market and commenting on how ESG trends are developing and playing out in emerging markets. I guess her sort of central thesis was that nobody should expect that in emerging market countries, ESG standards immediately can match or should match those in, again, let's call it Northwest Europe as a sort of generalization. And I think that just reading the quote here, she talked about a gradual, tailored incorporation of ESG standards is crucial. And I think, that's right. Nobody can expect companies and indeed regulatory environments in emerging markets immediately to leapfrog to being exactly where Northwest Europe, the UK, the Netherlands, or whichever country you pick has reached. On the other hand, and this comes to the dilemma I was just talking about. I think if you're a company, frankly, if you're Clyde & Co. And you're operating in emerging markets, you don't really have the luxury of just saying, well, look, the standards here aren't what we're used to back home, as it were, or where our investors are based, or where our HQ is based, or where the predominance of our workforce is based. The international expectation of civil society is that companies will operate to the highest standards they know of wherever they're operating. And I think, therefore, the challenge indeed is for the company to bring those standards and try to work to them from day one. And that's really hard because indeed there isn't often the same regulatory scrutiny or indeed legal frameworks to hold the company to account on, whether it's emissions to water or whether it's emissions to air or it's worker welfare standards. A lot of those things will be different. But I think the days where a company, a big multinational, has the luxury of saying, or not the luxury, but the excuse of saying, but that this is the local environment, but we're therefore not going to operate to the same standards as we would in our home market. I think those days are long gone. The expectation is that on most things, the company brings its own standards, and through governance, which I've always believed is the most important of the ESG triumvirate, that the governance of the company, whether it's the board or executive management, are doing their best to scrutinize and expect that the company will be operating to the same international standards wherever it operates. Now, of course, there will always be challenges and exceptions to that. I mean, just a really basic one would be salary levels. You're not suddenly going to go and pay all your workers all around the world at the same salary as the highest salary environment you work in. That would be economic suicide and probably very inflationary and all sorts of other complicating factors. Pensions as well. There'll be some markets that a company operates in where a pension is required, and there'll be some where it's not and where it's not provided. But one of the things I spent quite a bit of time working on in Qatar when I worked there, and this was before the 2022 World Cup, where there was so much international focus on the issue of worker welfare, just because you're not paying the workers exactly the same salary doesn't mean that they shouldn't expect dignity, quality accommodation, a very safe environment, and fundamentally a company that shows it cares. We had a great leader who, was very clear that you simply cannot expect people, or you should not expect workers of any nationality anywhere in the world to take care of themselves, to take care of each other, and take care of your facility from a sort of safety perspective if you as an employer are not showing care and taking care of them. So, I think how you set those standards, what level you expect, and how you gradually increase those over time, that is a corporate challenge as much as it is a local regulatory challenge.
Rob, sorry to interrupt, but you've described that so perfectly. But the immediate question that comes into my mind is there's just so much subjectivity and ambiguity over what is deemed to be the right level to get to. And then, of course, we've got concerns around, the just transition and the possible unintended, impact of applying particular ESG kind of frameworks and regulations, et cetera, and how they likely affect, the people locally. So, and again, I know it's the $64 million question or $1 billion question perhaps, but, how do organizations go about making sure that these subjective interpretations are managed appropriately? What's the anecdote?
I mean, I think, well, there's maybe three elements at least of that. One, as I say, is governance. So, there's lots of debate about whether environmental or social are the more important aspects of ESG. I really fundamentally believe it's the G, it's the governance. If you've got the right tone from the top, from the board, the chairman down, from the CEO, from the executive leadership down, then I think all sorts of good things can be done in the environmental and social space. If you do not have that, then despite the very best efforts from the ground level up, you're going to really struggle. So I think setting the tone that, the company is going to behave responsibly, is going to take care of people, not just employees and contractors, but also communities and others. I think that sort of ambition for continuous improvement set from the tone at the top is really important. A second thing is engaging, constantly talking to people. And that includes, of course, the local government, local regulators, local employees, local communities about what sort of standards they want and expect, which may be less than you want, but fine. I mean, at least then you know where you are and you know what sort of gap you have. But also engaging with investors, including, of course, especially the sort of ESG investment community who will focus on these issues more than others, perhaps. Listening to your employees, I think, the one of the big trends of the last few years has been growing employee activism in Northwest Europe, where often the agitators for change and improvement internationally within a company come from the staff as much as from any external NGO or investor pressure. So engaging to understand the expectations, to set out your own case as to what may be possible, how you're going to improve that over time. And indeed, then the third bit would be transparency, being really open and honest about the dilemmas, not, to your greenwashing charter's purpose, not overstating, not overinflating, not pretending everything is perfect, and being humble about the failures, the dilemmas, the challenges, and where you still want to get better. And I think if you've got all of those three things in place, you've got the best chance to find the right balance that enable you to be both an internationally competitive commercial entity, whilst also helping to raise standards locally wherever you operate. I mean, I've seen that time and time again, particularly with safety. In the oil and gas industry, of course, that's the number one priority every day in every operation. And the way that an international company can work with local contractors to help them become safer I mean, even in corporate affairs, we saw this, that the kind of companies that would come and build a stage at an event that we were hosting somewhere in the Middle East would start often with a very, very low safety standard. People would turn up to work in flip-flops and, with no plan as to how to operate safely. And we would, if we were contracting out, we wouldn't use those kind of companies. We would generally work with the ones that already had some level of safety standard, but we wouldn't just rule them out and say, if you're not up to our standard, we won't work with you. We would say, okay, what are the specific areas of intervention that we can make to help you get to a better standard so that you meet the standards that we're comfortable with, so that we are comfortable that you're keeping your own people and our people safe. And of course, if you do that, that starts to raise all boats in the market, because other companies realize that if they want to compete against the one or two who a multinational have been working with, they have to raise their standard too. And then when companies have got a contract from an international multinational company, whether it's Shell or anybody else, they can take that contract and show it to many other people and say, look, we've met really high international standards. So, I think that is just a constant process of engagement and improvement. One other thing in the article, one of the challenges I think about talking about ESG, I'm sure you'll have discovered this before in your podcast conversations, is quite easy for two people to have a conversation where actually they're comparing apples and pears. They're not really talking about the same thing. The article referred a few times to ESG initiatives. And I always have a slight sort of, flashing light bulb when I read that. Now, of course, there are different ways that about initiatives, but there's always a bit of a risk that ESG initiatives are sort of CSR programs or philanthropic gestures and activities. Whereas I think that, the way that a company shows up in an emerging market, the ESG is its entire behavior, its entire character, conduct, the way that that's exemplified through every engagement that people have with representatives of that company. So yes, some of that may fall into the sort of bracket of initiatives, including CSR, that still has a place. Or it may be an initiative to improve or reduce emissions, for example. That could be an initiative because it's a project. But I think overall, it's about that entire behavior of the way that the company shows up and interacts with people, and the standards that it sets and maintains and reports on. What gets measured gets done. So that's really important. I think all of that adds up to the ESG sort of commitment that a company has in an emerging market where it's working.
Rob, I totally agree with you. It always fills me with a slight shiver when I hear initiative. It immediately cheapens it in my mind. There's almost like an association as you beautifully and eloquently put, a lack of appreciation of just how fundamental ESG is or should be to an organization and a company. Let me play devil's advocate, or just throw a devil's advocate question. You brilliantly explained how, from winning a contract with a multinational perspective and improving the kind of ESG credentials of a local company in order to meet and to achieve that contract with a multinational. That totally makes sense. But what, in your experience, is there ever sort of pushback from local commerce in terms of having ESG kind of inflicted on them, if you like, and perhaps these expectations set that from their perspective, they're thinking, this is a costly exercise. You're requiring us to invest in doing something when actually all we are trying to achieve as an emerging, developing market is trying to maximize growth and development. How do you reconcile those kind of perhaps in the minds of...
I think that's true. Although I would say I don't think that is in any way exclusive to emerging markets. I mean, I think there would be suppliers and partners in the UK just as much as in Tanzania, for example, who would bristle at the requirements that a multinational company might put on them. I mean, I think you referred earlier to the just transition in energy, and I think that is a sort of poster child case for this because there are clearly a lot of stakeholders in Northwest Europe and elsewhere in the world who would like to see fossil fuels be phased out pretty much immediately. And yet there are many countries in Africa who have yet to really even start their oil and gas development journey. They know that they are sitting on some potential resources. They know that, 700 million Africans still don't have daily reliable access to electricity. So whilst the governments and stakeholders may be concerned about climate change and worried about the fact that African countries, for example, we're talking quite a lot about Africa, but this could be other emerging markets as well, may well end up being the most vulnerable to climate change.
Sure.
They also feel very strongly that they have a right to develop their own oil and gas resources, and that it wouldn't be fair that just because the West, the developed countries, have developed their oil and gas resources and burned so much of it and created so much man-made climate impact, that they should leave their resources in the ground and deny their citizens the potential economic benefit and hopefully also electricity benefit that may derive from those. So I think, that there is that real dilemma. And I think there are a lot of governments in Africa, a lot of African Development Bank and other organizations who are quite rightly saying, what right does the international climate movement, the Northwest Europeans and until at least recently the Americans as well, what right do they have to tell us how to use our resources? There was a very striking statistic in, I think it was the most recent IEA Africa Energy Outlook. They said that if Africa was to develop all of the gas resources that are known about but not yet developed today, and it all got burned for energy purposes somewhere in the world, that it would take Africa's contribution to global CO2 emissions from 3% to 3.5%.
Oh, wow.
So, and I think I've quoted that figure correctly, but I think, that just highlights for many, that's the sort of way that a lot of governments are looking at this. We should be allowed to develop our own resources. But that's challenging because when a company from Europe goes to do oil and gas exploration in Africa or indeed in Latin America or elsewhere, there are many stakeholders and constituencies who will criticize that and say, there shouldn't be any more, no more oil and gas exploration. Mm-hmm. So, just within the energy sector, just within that one concept of the just transition, you have these enormous dilemmas between the different pressures of a global issue, a sort of northern world perspective, a southern world perspective, and somewhere caught in the crosshairs of all of this are individuals and families and households who are just trying to live a better life, and these debates are raging around them.
And Rob, and you've already described it in a previous response, that in your mind, the keys to addressing the incredible complexity of resolving or solving the ESG dilemma in emerging markets is through the role of governance, stakeholder engagement, and transparency. And if you get those three elements right, ultimately those are the conditions at play to make good of a difficult, complex situation.
Well,
is that
hopefully make as few mistakes as possible. I mean, it's not easy to get it right. Let's be really clear. I mean, that's why I talked about, joining a company that worked really hard to get it right. But you won't always get it right. And whose definition of right are you working to? But at least you can strive for that.
Rob, that was absolutely brilliant. I'm now
super something about. Sorry, just finally on the article. Interesting, of course, that it was written by a lawyer in a law firm. I think one of the very impressive colleagues I worked with in my career, the former legal director of Shell, introduced a very simple but really powerful concept. And it was very important that it came from a lawyer, a legal director, which was to ask with every decision that the company was going to make, three things. Is it legal? Well, of course, that's the first question that anybody should ask, and you'd expect your lawyer to ask. But really importantly, he encouraged us all to go and be above and beyond that simply answering the is it legal question was not sufficient. The second question is it ethical? And that's a grayer area, and it gets you into debates, and it means you have to engage with stakeholders often to agree what is the right approach. But the third one I found most powerful was, is it wise? So is it legal? Is it ethical? And is it wise? And wisdom then, probably the wooliest concept of all of those three in some ways, but it actually forces you to think about a whole range of different ways in which the decision you're about to take may be perceived and experienced by different stakeholders, both back in your home market, in your most challenging market, in your local market, in other places, and also with a time element. I think one of the things we've seen quite a lot in certainly I've seen over the 25 years of my career is that something that is deemed acceptable today, even in just a few years' time, but often definitely by the time you get to a decade hence, people will look back and say, how on earth could they have ever taken that decision? And so almost sort of future-proofing the wisdom and the acceptability of what you're about to do is, it's obviously really hard to do that, but just going through that thought process, having those conversations internally and often with external parties as well before you make a decision, I think is a really helpful guide to get you to the right point on your compass as a company is seeking to invest, particularly in emerging markets where the letter of the law may not be as clear to guide you as it would be elsewhere in the world.
Hi, Robert. It's absolutely, you've given us some brilliant gold throughout this podcast, and that I have to say is as shiny as any other bit.
Well, I'm stealing from others, so yeah, we can all stand on the shoulders of giants.
Well, indeed, but I think that's fantastic, and I think that could be, in all honesty, that can be applied to any organization or any individual in a governance position choosing to make a decision about anything relating to their organization. I think that's absolutely fantastic. Rob, you've already given us, as I say, some great suggestions. So I'm fascinated to hear what you're going to do with this ever increasingly used magic wand. But let me throw the question at you, Rob. If we were to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
Well, yeah, I thought about this a bit. It's really hard, and as a corporate affairs professional, I think there's all sorts of things you might want, including better data that enables corporate affairs professionals to come to these kind of dilemmas with more evidence and more statistics and data to challenge the commercial decisions. But I think if I was to choose just one thing, because I think it's been the single thing that has changed most over the 25 years that I've worked in the oil and gas sector, but I'm not sure is consistent even within that sector, and definitely not across all companies, is for the governance. So I come back to that, the heads of the company, whether it's public or private, to make their senior appointment decisions, particularly, of course, the CEO and the top exco of a company, based on those individuals' EQ alongside their IQ, and their EQ being that ability to think about how decisions will be perceived and how ethical those decisions are. Because it is just so easy, particularly in a company like the one I spent a lot of my career in, that is very engineering focused, people who are trained to find the right answer at the bottom right-hand corner of a spreadsheet, to get away from that mindset and say, there isn't going to be a perfect right answer here. There are going to be trade-offs, there are going to be dilemmas, and have leaders who instinctively understand that. Doesn't mean that they're always going to be capable themselves of being the smartest person in the room to make that right judgment, but that they are going to have the awareness and the humility to seek counsel from elsewhere before they make those decisions. And I think if you've got that, then the chance of the company doing the right thing versus the wrong thing significantly improves. And of course, for somebody like me as a corporate affairs professional, it makes our life a lot easier and more enjoyable that you are invited into a conversation to bring those different perspectives and chew over these really difficult dilemmas and decisions versus companies that still hire and promote based solely on people who are able to deliver at the bottom line and make the very best NPV decisions, where they may be much more closed to that challenge and to the understanding that there's going to be different ways forward, and it may not always be that simply the cheapest or the one that's going to generate the most profit is the right way ahead.
Here, Rob. It's a brilliant suggestion. I have to admit, it's something that's coming up, on a number of occasions with our magic wand. I think that we had a show recently with a lady called Lauren Wilkinson who recently finished. She was a senior marketer at Bacardi until recently, and she has recently done a piece of research on one of her master's courses, I think, or it might have been a PhD. Lauren, if I've got that wrong, apologies. Specifically looking at, the key characteristics of some of the most purpose-driven organizations of the world. And she's done some fascinating interviews with some of the world's most impactful organizations, CEOs. And it very much aligns with what you've just described there. Emotional intelligence is one of the key sort of barometers of those organizations' impact, if you like, and the driving of it. Rob, absolutely fantastic. I'm going to stop rambling on. That was brilliant to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
And that's it for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big thank you to Rob Sherwin, Corporate Affairs Director, for sharing his insights on navigating ESG challenges in emerging markets and the complexities of corporate diplomacy. Today, we explored the balance between responsible business practices and economic realities, uncovering strategies for sustainable investment in high-risk markets while ensuring ethical governance and compliance. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter, championing responsible sustainability communications. Visit antigreenwashcharter.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.